Hello, I'm Amy Hawthorne, Deputy Director for Research at the Project on Middle East Democracy, or POMED, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the latest episode of our author interview series, Between the Lines. In this series, POMED interviews authors of recent works, articles, or books that touch on themes of authoritarianism and the struggle for democracy and human rights in the Middle East and North Africa. And I'm delighted to be here today with Dr. Sharan Grewal to talk about his article in the current issue of the journal Security Studies, titled Norm Diffusion Through US Military Training in Tunisia. And this is a fascinating article because it links two topics or two themes. One, US efforts to promote democracy abroad, and two, challenges to democracy here in the United States that are often addressed separately, but these days especially really need to be understood as connected. You raise, Sharan, the critical issue of exactly what aspects of the American political system, in this particular case, civil-military relations, are being transmitted to recipients of US foreign aid. Tunisia, a country you've worked on extensively for the past decade, is your case study in this piece. Sharan is a professor at William & Mary, a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution, and non-resident senior fellow at POMED. And he's a very well-known expert on Tunisia. Thank you so much for joining us, Sharan, and let's jump in.
My pleasure. Thanks for the invitation.
Sharan, to start, can you tell us a little bit about what US military training for foreign military personnel is? What do these programs involve? And what have US officials tended to claim about this type of military aid as a democracy promotion tool?
Foreign military training is one of the most commonly used tools in US foreign policy, but probably one of the least studied. And one of the reasons why is because there's so many different types. There have been at least 30 different US programs over the years that have provided some training to foreign militaries, whether to individual countries like Iraq, Afghanistan, Ukraine, or as programs that are more regional and global in scope. And so the most well-known of these programs is IMET, the International Military Education and Training Program, which began in the 70s and funds both foreign officers coming to the United States for education, so attending, for instance, US war colleges or the Command and Staff College or military academies, but it also funds US military officials going to countries to conduct shorter trainings of foreign militaries. Other than IMET, another well-known program is the Countering Terrorism Fellowship Program, CTFP, which began after 9/11. Theo McLaughlin and his colleagues calculate that across all of these different military training programs, the US since 1999 has trained over 2 million foreign military personnel. Many of those trainees were from Iraq and Afghanistan, but they find that almost every country has seen some of their officers trained by the United States. In Tunisia, for instance, the case I know well, about 5,000 military personnel have received some US training through IMET and CTFP since the 70s, and about 1,000 in the last decade post-Arab Spring. And so this is a fairly commonly used and fairly widespread foreign policy tool. And it's not necessarily a cheap foreign policy tool. Since 1999, the United States has spent some $15 billion on foreign military trainings, and that's not including Iraq and Afghanistan. So this is a pretty big investment. And so why would the US engage in foreign military training? Generally, there are three explicitly made justifications for these programs, or three goals of these programs. The first and most direct is to improve partner militaries' ability to fight, to improve their military effectiveness, to counter terrorism, to ensure security. It is training for the partner military. The second goal is to improve coordination with the United States. The hope is that by training foreign militaries in the jargon of the US, in the systems that the US uses, that will improve their ability to, if needed, conduct joint operations in the future. And the hope is also that it will increase their desire to get involved in joint operations, to align them geostrategically with the United States moving forward. But then the third goal, explicitly made by the Department of State, by the Department of Defense, when they justify these programs to Congress, the third goal is that these programs are helping to professionalize foreign militaries. They are exposing foreign militaries to the norms of the US military, the embrace of democracy, the embrace of civilian control, the respect for human rights. And so the explicit goal of these programs is to try to inculcate those norms and values into foreign militaries. And so that's the goal, that's the justification for these programs that I try to address and assess in this paper.
So does this kind of US military training actually work? Does it produce more professional militaries?
So the empirical record is fairly mixed. Your audience here at POMED is probably familiar with Egypt's Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, who studied at the US Army War College in 2006, but then went on to not only stage a coup in 2013, but also to orchestrate a massacre of protesters and to repress almost all of the opposition. Yes. Tunisia's former president, Ben Ali, likewise had trained in the US before staging his coup against Bourguiba. And just in the last year alone, we've seen coups in Mali, in Guinea, in Burkina Faso, all of which were led by US trained officers. Wow. But the question is, are these just isolated examples? Are they the exceptions or are they the rule? And so political scientists have tried to see if there's any statistical correlation between US training programs and these outcomes. And so far, the results have been pretty mixed. Some of the early work, for instance, by Carol Atkinson, finds that US training correlates with positive outcomes, with higher levels of democracy, with higher respect for human rights. But other research, for instance, by Savage and Caverly, find that US training actually increases the likelihood of a coup, suggesting that the record so far is pretty mixed. And so why might it be mixed is the question I tried to address in this piece. And what I argue is that one reason that it might be mixed is because democracy, civilian control, human rights, these might not be the only norms that are diffusing abroad to foreign officers, that there might be other more political norms in the US military that foreign officers are also picking up on.
Can you say more about this? What norms or what unhealthy trends, as you call them in the piece, are shifting in the United States? And why do some scholars see these trends in civil military relations as potentially unhealthy for US democracy?
Since at least the 1990s, scholars of the US military have been warning that the US military is becoming more politicized. And these scholars generally point to two trends. One trend is that the US military is becoming too politically partisan. And the second trend is that it's becoming too politically powerful. So let me take each of those in turn. The first is about partisanship. As late as the 1970s, if you asked US military officers which party do you support, the majority would say neutral, don't know, or none. In general, the military was nonpartisan. But if you ask today US military officers what party they support, the majority will openly say Republican. And that shift from the 70s to the 90s has been well documented by scholars like Ole Holsti, like Peter Fever, like Richard Cohn, among many others. And this partisanship manifests in a whole spectrum of political activities or behavior, some worse than others. At the most minor scale, you have voting in elections as an expression of this partisanship. And the US military indeed votes at higher rates than civilians in the United States. You also see this partisanship manifest in terms of discussing politics at work, disparaging certain parties at work, in posting partisan takes, for instance, on social media, and, for instance, in retired generals endorsing presidential candidates in elections. And on the one hand, you can say that all of this is normal and shouldn't be problematic, that they are Americans like any others. Military officers should have the right to vote. They should have the right to express their political opinions. And indeed, voting, for instance, in elections is something that the military explicitly encourages here in the United States. But at the other hand, scholars, as well as some military officers, also argue that this partisanship can be damaging for civil-military relations, that military officers often face this dilemma, that on the one hand, they have to obey orders that are constitutional from civilian leaders, but on the other hand, they are to refuse orders that are unconstitutional. And that's where partisan calculations might seep in those moments of ambiguity when you're trying to decide, is this order I was given constitutional? Is it something I follow or refuse? That's when these partisan calculations, scholars warn, might seep in terms of, might your, if you, for instance, oppose the president, would that make you take the same calculation in that scenario as if you supported the president?
Right.
So that's one trend about growing partisanship in the US military. The other trend is about the US military becoming more powerful politically, encroaching on the turf of civilians in the civilian-military relationship. And this has been fueled in part by both sides in the civil-military relationship. On both sides, you have a growing attitude that military officers know national security issues better than civilians because of their experience, and therefore that they should be given a bigger say on national security issues. And so this likewise manifests in a number of political activities. Scholars like Peter Fever describe how military officers might be more likely today to shirk when they're given orders, thinking they know national security issues better than civilians, and that might lead to some dilemmas in civil-military relations. Likewise, other scholars like Risa Brooks show that military officers might lobby other branches of government to put pressure on the civilian leadership. And you also see this political power manifested in the number of retired officers who then go on to serve in government. Retired officers today increasingly populate formerly civilian positions in the government. Throughout the Department of Defense, for instance, one study found that between 2001 and 2014, about 41,000 military retirees walked back into the Department of Defense as civilians. And in recent decades, we've seen retired military officers, even at the highest levels, Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, National Security Advisor, even for presidents. I find that 77% of presidents post-World War II were at one point in their lives commissioned military officers. And that military experience for presidents, for secretaries of defense, is a quality that both the public and the military values. In surveys, for instance, of the US military, large proportions say that for the president to merit respect as commander-in-chief, he needs to have served in uniform. So there is this devaluing of civilian expertise in favor of military experience. And that likewise, although it has become normalized, is potentially damaging to civil-military relations. It weakens civilian control to have retired officers rather than pure civilians in civilian roles. And what the evidence suggests globally is that having more retired officers in these senior positions in government tends to lead to less transparency and oversight over the military and its activities, less restricted defense budgets, and there's also some evidence of more hawkish security policies, both domestically and abroad, as a result of more retired officers in senior positions. And so these two trends, this partisanship and how powerful politically the military has become, are on the one hand normalized. It's seen as they have every right to vote in elections, get involved in politics, to serve in government after retirement. But on the other hand, potentially have these detrimental or corrosive consequences for civil-military relations here at home.
Fascinating. And in your article, you contrast these issues in the United States with civil-military relations in France. And here in another democracy, it's actually, I hadn't realized it's very, very different. These things aren't, well, I think in France, members of the military aren't allowed to vote. You theorize in your article that these trends don't just matter here in the United States for our political system, but also because they are being socialized in foreign trainees via IMET. Tell us about how you tested this theory in Tunisia and what your findings were.
Yeah, so the theory I put forth is that these political trends we've seen in the US military might also be diffusing to foreign officers. And it's not that the US military is intentionally teaching foreign officers to be partisan or to be more involved in politics, but that foreign officers might more passively observe what's happening in the US military, come to think that that is how a professional military should behave, that that's normal and healthy for a professional military if they're seeing it in the paragon of professionalism, the US military, and therefore come to emulate this behavior as this is how a professional military should behave. So what I do is I look in Tunisia and I show how through both interviews and surveys of the Tunisian military, that these more political norms might also be diffusing through US training. And what I find in the interviews is that the US trained officers I spoke with said that they noticed these trends in the US military. They noticed, for instance, that American officers regularly vote for Republicans and Democrats, and they came to believe that therefore voting in elections is something healthy, that that's what professional militaries should do. And that in turn has shaped their behaviors. The US trained officers on average, I find, are more supportive of the military, therefore having the right to vote in elections. Likewise, the officers I interviewed said that they noticed in the US military how retired officers would be appointed to senior positions, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor, etc., and thought that therefore that's normal and healthy as well, that therefore should happen in Tunisia too. We also have a very professional military in Tunisia, and so we should be following what the US is doing on that dimension as well. And so you saw in the US trained officers this heightened belief that retired officers should be serving as Minister of Defense, even to be serving as president. And that seems to be the result of this emulation and learning from US military training. And so what I do is I conduct two surveys of the Tunisian military, one among retired senior officers and one among more junior military personnel. And I find that in both surveys, we see these same effects, that those with US training were more supportive of the military voting and more supportive of retired military officers serving as Minister of Defense and as presidents. So in short, the key findings there from this study are first that civil-military relations in the United States are not perfect. They're pretty good, but they're not perfect. And those imperfections might also be diffusing abroad. And relatedly, that they might be diffusing abroad even though the US isn't intentionally aiming for that. It's not something taught explicitly, but it is something that foreign officers might more passively observe and emulate. And US military should therefore be aware of those more indiscreet or subtle socialization processes. And the third major finding here from this study is that that socialization effect doesn't stop once they end that program in the US and they return home. That actually those with US training continue to follow what's happening in the US. Having learned English, having made friends in the US military, they're still aware of what's happening even in the decades after they've left the United States. My interviewees, for instance, were still aware of the civil military dimensions under Trump, despite having trained in the United States in the 80s and 90s. And so, in short, I argue that these more political norms that might also be diffusing to foreign officers, that might help explain why the empirical record of US military training is relatively mixed. If foreign officers have in essence learned from the US that it's okay to be partisan or that it's okay to serve in senior positions in government, then that might provide the ideological facilitating conditions for more political involvement. Indeed, it might help foreign officers even justify to themselves that political involvement might actually be professional, that being partisan, serving in government, that actually is something that professional militaries do and that therefore they might get involved in as well.
Your research and your findings, I think, raise a lot of questions about whether similar research would be useful and interesting in other types of areas of US foreign assistance and democracy assistance abroad, such as parliamentary development, political party training, civil society strengthening, the idea that the recipients of that training are absorbing potentially lessons in addition to or other than what the democracy promotion providers are trying to impart about democracy. But turning back to Tunisia, the Tunisian military has played an important political role since July 25th, when President Kaïs Saïed executed a power grab or a type of coup. Notably, the Tunisian military has kept the parliament blocked, which has helped to or been key in the president's enforcement of his suspension and eventual dissolution of that democratically elected parliament. Do your findings, do you think, go any way towards explaining the Tunisian military's role since July 25th?
They might. And it comes back to this dilemma I mentioned earlier about what a military officer should do when they're given a potentially unconstitutional order, because it results in this conflict of norms. On the one hand, civilian control tells you that you should obey the orders of the civilian president. On the other hand, you shouldn't when those orders are unconstitutional. And so when President Kaïs Saïed last July 25th ordered the military, presumably the chief of the land army, Mohammed al-Ghul, ordered him to close down the parliament. I am trying to imagine what might have been in his head. That on the one hand, I should obey orders. That's what I've been taught. I've been instilled with this notion of civilian control. But on the other hand, isn't this order unconstitutional? Isn't the parliament supposed to always remain in permanent session, even in states of emergency? But you might also, and we don't yet know what exactly he was thinking. He hasn't spoken publicly about that moment. It could be something as simple as, I deferred to the civilian president in his interpretation that it was constitutional, because after all, Kaïs Saïed is a constitutional law professor. If anyone knows if this action is constitutional, I should defer to him. So it could have been as simple as that in terms of his decision to therefore follow the order and close the parliament. But as I alluded to earlier, in these moments of ambiguity, when the norms seem to conflict, that's when the partisan calculations could seep in. And so other officers I've talked to have mentioned that even if the order was a little bit unconstitutional, they have supported the order nonetheless because they agreed with it politically. They wanted or they bought into the political vision that this was a way to clean up the political system, potentially to improve and restore democracy. And so in that sense, it's possible that the partisan considerations might have seeped into their calculations in that moment. Again, this is speculation. We don't know what Mohammed al-Ghul was thinking in that moment, but it's possible that these sorts of politicization that might occur through US training in the sense of an acceptance of partisanship might therefore have affected the Tunisian military's decision there during the power grab.
It's really interesting. And finally, what will you be watching for, looking for going forward in Tunisia in terms of the military's political role or potential politicization? As President Saïed is seeking to create a new republic that many in Tunisia fear will be actually a new dictatorship. And what kind of positive influence, if any, could the United States try to exert here through its ties with the Tunisian military?
Thus far, the Tunisian military has tried to stay relatively distant from Kaïs Saïed. They seem to not want to be associated with the power grab. Although they followed the order to close the parliament, for instance, they soon retreated behind the gates of the parliament and allowed the police to be stationed outside of the gates to actually deal with protesters calling for the parliament to be reopened. They don't want to be on the front lines defending, in essence, the president's policies. Likewise, we see rumors here and there that the military might not want to go along with some of the excesses of President Kaïs Saïed's crackdown on political parties and civil society. But at this point, it's pretty unclear. What is clear, on the other hand, is that the military is being used by President Kaïs Saïed in other ways, especially through the use of military courts. Which you could say is more autonomous from the rest of the military, the ones that receive US training. But the judges in the military courts seem to be accepting all the cases that are coming before them from the Ministry of Justice, from the president, against various members of parliament, potentially against political parties. And that's something to watch moving forward. The use of military courts, in essence, the politicization of the military by civilian leaders, in this case by President Kaïs Saïed, that's something to watch moving forward. And so what role can the US play in this case? As we've seen through foreign military training, the US does gain some influence. It builds some relationships with partner militaries. We saw this, for instance, familiar to your audiences in 2011 in Egypt, when President Obama in his memoirs, Robert Gates in his memoirs say that they pressured the Egyptian military not to fire on protesters during that 2011 Arab Spring uprising. And it's possible that that US pressure might have been one of the many factors that led the Egyptian military not to engage in a full-scale crackdown there in 2011. And so the US, through its foreign military training, might similarly have some influence and leverage over the Tunisian military through these decades of relationships that it has built up through these trainings. And that, in theory, could likewise be leveraged here to convince the Tunisian military to stay apolitical, not to defend Kaïs Saïed's power grab and facilitate his power grab through, for instance, the use of military courts. That would be an important message, I think, that the US should send to Tunisia.
Thank you so much, Sharan. Your article really advances our understanding of the impacts of US military training overseas, which, as you noted at the beginning of our conversation, is a very, very significant part of US military engagement with governments around the world. And your article also is very thought-provoking in terms of thinking about the current state of civil-military relations in the United States and how foreign interlocutors and foreign audiences, if you will, are looking at this and potentially absorbing some of what's going on here in the United States, which may not necessarily be positive for civil military relations in a democracy. So thank you so much. We've been here talking with Sharan Grewal, talking about his new article in Security Studies, the journal Security Studies, Norm Diffusion through US military training in Tunisia. Thank you so much, Sharan.
Thank you for having me.